Čujemo se. Now we're going to, I hope you enjoy your break, had a good coffee, tea, whatever. Now we're going to have a session named Structural Inequalities in Culture and Creative Industries. I invite us here to join Mark Taylor, Jaka Primorac, and Sanja Bojanić, please. And now I'm going to inform you about their short biographies, just so you know who they are, if you don't know already. So Mark Taylor is a senior lecturer in quantitative methods at the Sheffield Methods Institute, University of Sheffield, and is a HRC Leadership Fellow, Creative Economy until 2021. Jaka Primorac works as a senior research associate at the Department for Culture and Communication, Institute for Development and International Relations in Zagreb. And our Sanja is a moderator, teacher. She works at the Academy of Applied Arts at the University of Rijeka and also works for Center for Advanced Studies, Southeast Europe. Sanja, you will present them more. They will present their work, their research, and after it we can talk, you can ask questions, give us comments, and then we have a lunch. So enjoy and good luck.
Hello, everybody. We will try to be dynamic in our presentations, change a bit the rhythm, in fact, when you hear panic, social class, taste, and inequality in the creative industries, then you think, okay, so what is going to happen? Are we going to escape somewhere? What is it that we are going to do? And this is the title, actually, of our first presentation. So, Mark, I'll let you the floor, and we will have, luckily, time for Q&A, which will allow us to raise the debate about these topics that you are going to announce.
Cool, thanks very much. Can you switch to the PDF slide deck, please? So I'm going to talk about, my title, as has just been explained, is quite dense and quite heavy and quite intimidating, possibly. So I will, while on the one hand, you know, you're in safe hands, don't worry, nothing is going to catch fire during the next hour. However, I'm going to try and make an argument, sort of feeding in from what we've already heard about this morning, that, you know, there is a problem. The problem is pretty fundamental. The problem is informed by a wide range of different influences, and the kind of sort of suggestions for fixes that you see from government agencies, different bits of cultural and creative work, are pretty, I'm not very optimistic about opportunities for success, because a lot of what I'm talking about represents sort of big structural issues, structural inequalities in cultural and creative work, a lot of which reflect structural inequalities more generally. The idea of, you know, we're going to give another 10 million euros to the cultural sector and then all of the problems will be solved, I think is a bit ambitious. So, in the UK and indeed in other parts of the world, this has been getting quite prominent. Discussions about inequalities in creative work have been becoming increasingly prominent. And this has partly been in response to the fact that until maybe a few years ago, most of the focus, when we said inequalities, that was effectively code for gender and ethnicity. Mm-hmm. And this is not to make an argument that gender and ethnicity aren't important. Of course, gender and ethnic inequalities are absolutely essential and central to understand life in creative labour. The argument that this is trying to push is that there's more to it than that. When we see various high-profile members of minority ethnic groups, high-profile women and gender and sexual minorities, for example, one of the things that we've tended to find is that those people have been from tremendously privileged backgrounds. And so one of the things that we've tried to unpack is, you know, the ways in which different axes of inequality work together. I partly just flagged this up because I thought it was funny, it was in GQ. Because the stakes here are, it is weird sort of having this angle, I'll do my best to look at you rather than away from you, is that there's this idea in policy discourses in the UK, everything's fine obviously at the moment in UK politics, questions of inequalities and cultural creative work are absolutely the priority. You can see, so this is a piece written by Matt Hancock, who was the then minister for the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport, who was actually quite well liked. A lot of the time, DCMS ministers are not very well received by the cultural sector. The idea is that they don't understand, you know, the tremendous dynamism going on in creativity. But Matt Hancock was quite well liked. And he argued that creativity is one of the greatest forces of social mobility in British society. And the difficulty here is that there's the belief that in the sector and in government that arts and culture are a force for social mobility. And what the research indicates is that arts and culture are a tool for social inequality and social persistence, which is a challenge. And so this has kind of come out of a project that I worked on with colleagues at the University of Edinburgh, Dave O'Brien and Orion Brooke. I've included this slide basically because they gave us the money, so it's polite to at least mention them. And it turned into the report that I have behind me, which is also the title of this presentation, which it would be lovely if you would read. One of the things about doing academic work, obviously, about questions of social inequality in CCIs, is that people who actually work in CCIs don't normally read it. It's partly because people are busy. You know, like it's not, there is this problem, you know, much as with anything else of, oh, have you not been to this exhibition? Have you not seen this production? Have you not read this novel? People are busy. But the second issue is that we don't write very well, as academics tend to write for other academics. And so the kinds of things that we produce can be quite dry, and it's not obvious where the action is. What we've tried to do in this report, which you can either Google it, it's the same title as the title of this presentation, or I've popped a link in there. We've tried to synthesize a bunch of different research that we've been doing in various different teams with various other colleagues and collaborators for a couple of years now to kind of set the scene. But I will now talk about some of that content. It's been interesting to work on because, as I say, you know, this is something that is more directly facing different bits for CCIs. It covers a really wide range of things. But one of the issues that got picked up most prominently was about small numbers of people from working class backgrounds who get to work in different bits of CCIs. This is both generally when we talk about the cultural and creative industries, which I'm sure is a term that people recognise some of the shortcomings with, but also when we talk about individual bits of it, so the classical music press identifying problems in classical music is a mess. And this also involved various presentations. Reniedo Lodge, who's the author of Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, gave a presentation towards the end of the day about how these issues manifest themselves more generally. And so what I'm going to try and do is, one of the through arguments of the document involves trying to understand and explain the persistence of inequalities in CCIs. And I kind of need to go through those bits one at a time. Because when you make that argument, there's quite a lot baked into it. And so people might say, oh, like on the one hand, people might think, there are no inequalities in CCIs, it's open, it's meritocracy, people can do what they want. And so the argument, the way that you respond to that is a bit different from people saying, the reason why the arts are so unequal is because rent in London is so expensive, if we had some housing reform, then everything would be fine. So I flag this because not everyone necessarily agrees with some of the work that we're doing. There is this idea, there's this temptation to think of everyone working in creative work as a particular kind of left wing. And this kind of, I mean, this is a little bit unfair, this response.
You think so? No.
As in, like, when you read the whole thing, he's like, the analysis is a little bit more sophisticated. But
okay.
These are some of the key sort of data. So I have three rows here. Full data you can find in the report, but this is just to give a flavour. If you look at people of colour, so in the UK, about 13% of people are what's referred to as BAME, which is Black, Asian or Minority Ethnic. Those corresponding figures in museums, galleries and libraries, about 2.7%. In visual arts and music and performance, it's about 4.8%. That's obviously way below the national average. It's particularly sharp when you recognise that most of these people live in London. And while the national average is 13%, the London average is 40%. So these are super low figures. If we're talking about measures of social class, which I alluded to at the start, about a third of people in the UK are what we might refer to as from working class origins. I'm not going to unpack today exactly what I mean when I talk about that, because it's quite a long explanation. About a third of people worked in publishing in particular, but in other bits of CCIs as well, the numbers are way below that. When you look at gender segregation, it's a little bit different, because in sectors like film, TV, radio and photography, the numbers of women are very low. In other sectors like museums, galleries and libraries, the numbers are very high. But this doesn't necessarily mean that there are no inequalities in museums, galleries and libraries, because these women are not paid well. I was at an event last week where somebody described processes of ameliorating inequalities in creative work as lubricating the pipeline to hell, which has really stuck with me. And again, policy is difficult here. Chris Bryant, who was the then Labour shadow DCMS minister, argued that there was a problem, that historically, you know, we'd had people from working class backgrounds represented in the arts, and now there are various, the situation seems quite different, Coldplay exists. And the response from James Blunt, who did You're Beautiful and is very funny on Twitter, responded with a Guardian article saying, "Your populist, envy-based ideas make our country crap far more than me and my shit songs and my plumbing accents." And so, hopefully, I've made the argument that there are inequalities in culture and creative work in a UK context. Incidentally, a lot of this translates internationally, but I've only got half an hour. But I've argued that these are persistent. One of the things that you see in quotes like this very prominently is this idea that it's a new phenomenon, that people can point to artists from the past who were from working class backgrounds, who were now very successful, and these people aren't visible anymore. And I think this is a really hazardous way to think about things, because there's this idea of there's a golden age, we just need to make everything like it was before and things will be okay. This is partly a problem because it wasn't, you know, people didn't necessarily have great experiences, and inequalities manifest themselves in quite different ways. I wouldn't have wanted to be a woman working in advertising in the 1970s. But I also don't think it's correct. I'm going to race through a lot of this, because a lot of this is technical, and there's a paper that you can read if you really want the details. But when we talk about social class, there's a temptation to think of it in quite a romantic way, to think of the kind of school that people went to, people's subjective experience, there's a lot of ideas of feeling, working class, and so on. We're operationalising this with respect to an official measure of class in the UK, which is about the kind of work that you do. And we've grouped people broadly into three categories, which are managerial and professional jobs, which you might describe as middle class. There's a group called intermediate. It's fiddly using the word middle class when it's sort of the top of the three. Intermediate, which includes things like technical and clerical work, lots of people who are self-employed. And then there are jobs called what's referred to as semi-routine and routine jobs. These include things like being a bus driver, working in factories, different kinds of clerical work, you know, like sort of filing, that kind of thing, working in data entry, cleaning and different kinds of hospitality, and so on. And there's broadly, this summarises the results. if we look at what happened over a 30-year period, it's true to say that the fraction of people who worked in the arts who came from a middle-class background increased. In fact, it more than doubled from about 15% to about 36%. And the opposite is the case for working-class jobs. It went from about 22% of people to about 12% of people. This is kind of the key slide in terms of when I'm talking about persistence. There are not that many people my age whose parents worked in mining. Of my parents' generation, there are quite a lot of people of that age who worked in mining. That's because the structure of the economy has changed. While artists are correct to observe that the fraction of people, that the makeup of the culture and creative industries in terms of social class origin has changed, the number of people from middle-class backgrounds having increased, this almost entirely reflects changes in the economy. If you want to change culture, you need to change society. There's some more detail, blah, 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 more of the same. And so we're arguing this isn't newly bad. Things have always been bad. But how do we explain it? A lot of the explanations that you see from people working in politics, also people working in the CCIs themselves, when you talk to actors who are now in their 60s or 70s reflecting on how they think it will be difficult for them to come through today, they point to things like the costs of doing unpaid internships. Unpaid internships aren't necessarily socially exclusive because you can probably only afford to do one if you have another source of income. For example, wealthy parents, or you can stay with somebody in London, or you have an independent source of income. Living in London is now ruinously expensive in a way that it wasn't in the 1980s. So these are all sort of like valid explanations. But if this was what was going on, we'd have expected those lines that I showed you earlier to have got diverged even more dramatically. Middle-class people have always been dominating the sector. They've just been doing it in slightly different ways. And there's a few different ways that we try to approach to think about this. The first one is thinking about who people working in cultural and creative industries are friends with. Who do they hang out with? Because artists don't only hang out with each other. Like when they're in social settings, when they're with their friends, when they're talking about things, who do they know? And so this reflects a survey that we did a couple of years ago now, where one of the things that we asked people, so we had about 2,500 people working in cultural and creative jobs in the UK, most of them are in the UK, some of them were Brits who were international. Obviously, in a UK context, it's creative work, it's a very international sector. While these people in the UK, they're not all Brits, far from it. Who are their friends? Who do they know socially? Who are their family members? And almost all of them were friends with people like me. I am friends with artists and musicians. This kind of captures a broader phenomenon. The kinds of people who artists and musicians and other people working in the CCIs know, we felt like obviously a lot of them know other CCI workers, but they tend to know people working in other kinds of middle-class jobs. The social world of cultural and creative work in the UK is a middle-class world. They are also, this is some analysis based on, that's just come out in a paper last week, it has taken a long time to get through, indicates that people working in the arts are the most liberal occupational group of any sector in the UK. We're measuring liberalism through various different kinds of questions. It's not just a case of how liberal are you, 1 to 10. They're also the most left-wing. And we talk about this, and one of the challenges here is, these are my values. I'm not saying, oh, they're all left-wing and liberal and this is a disaster because we need more conservative artists. But in an environment, like, as I've alluded to, things aren't going that well in terms of, like, the social situation and the social contracts in the UK. There's this notion of Britain pulling apart where people in different social positions are getting less and less like each other. People are less and less likely to hang out with people who are less like them. People's values in different kinds of roles in different parts of society are pulling further and further apart. Artists are seen as an elite. And to be honest, this isn't an unfair description. Artists hang out with other people in privileged social situations. artists have values that are very unlike the rest of societies. This doesn't just reflect the fact that they're the most liberal group. It shows these are quite big differences. If they were the most liberal group, but everyone was left-wing and liberal like me, that's not a society in crisis. What we have is that the group of people who are tasked to reflect and represent society back to the nation are this left-wing, liberal, socially closed, disproportionately middle class, disproportionately white, privileged group. We've got a problem. And this is also a group of people whose behaviour, they hang out in different settings. They go to different sorts of things. You know, partly this is inevitable. It's not that surprising that artists go to art events. But they have different friends. They have different values. They hang out in different settings. It's a real challenge when you have a group of people who seem to be representing themselves as radicals, as, you know, like sort of like, if you think about the ways that artists and CCI workers in society have tended to represent themselves, if they are all from this privileged group, but they're representing themselves as iconoclasts, you can see why people don't really trust them. The last thing to say in this context, to provide a real contrast, is one of the other things that we asked about in that survey was this question of what do you think is important in terms of getting ahead in the sector? If you want to be successful in cultural and creative work, and this reflects work that's happening here in Rijeka as well, what do you think is important? If this is a left-wing liberal group that recognises that they're a privileged set of people, you might think that they would say, yeah, we understand that your class is really important, your gender is really important, your ethnicity is really important, this is how these inequalities manifest themselves. But what we found is that overwhelmingly people said hard work, talent, ambition. People played down these structural problems. And so this is a group of people who argue for structural inequality, recognise structural inequalities in society, but they're not necessarily so reflexive about it in their own lives. How am I doing on time?
Go on.
So we've got a puzzle. How do we reconcile these different issues? And we started trying to reconcile this puzzle by recognising that people aren't oblivious. When I say the NICs, the director of the Arts Council, the director of the Tate, and the director of the National Theatre a couple of years ago were all called Nick. And so I find it a really neat shorthand for... they are nice people. And so we kind of have these three main... And so, you know, like these people are giving speeches about the problems, recognising that there aren't enough people from historically marginalised groups. So how do we reconcile it? And so we sort of have three main explanations. The first is that you can't really be explicitly sexist anymore. In the 1970s, you know, like realistically, this feels like a room full of people that have watched all of Mad Men. The ways in which people were able to explicitly talk about members of groups that they weren't in was pretty open. Now, the language has shifted. There is a kind of shift in the language. We heard a little bit about this before. The use of the word diversity. Obviously, we're kind of reproducing it today. It's really interesting seeing how, like, when I talk about this stuff, the word I lead with is inequality. When I'm in sector audiences, when I'm working with cultural and creative industries, I hear the word inclusion. And the different perspectives, I think, give some kind of gesture towards that. The idea of neoliberal subjectivity, I thought this might be a bit heavy, but we had quite a lot of it earlier, so it's always nice when somebody does a bit of your work for you. So the way that we tried to get at this was to do some interviews. We spoke to, we did 239 interviews with people working in cultural and creative jobs following the survey. So what we did was, at the end of the survey, we said, if you'd like to talk to us more, can you leave your email? Quite a lot of them did. We did interviews for about an hour with them. And what I'm doing here is I'm talking about 32 of what we described as senior men. They're almost all white. They're not... Senior is obviously doing quite a lot of work here, because we all know that just because you work in a creative organisation and you have the word job type, like the word manager or senior in your description, doesn't mean you have very much money. But these are people who are making decisions. And crucially, these are people who are making hiring decisions. When they advertise jobs, we know that these roles are incredibly competitive. And so we wanted to understand who are the people that are making the decisions, because ultimately that's one of the key ways through which these inequalities persist. And so it was very unusual for our participants to not recognise inequalities in the cultural and creative industries. They would often mention it without any of the interviewers having to explicitly say, so, you know, what do you think about gender, or what do you think about social class, or anything else in your line of work? And the tension was, on the one hand, when we talked to them about the sector, they would immediately say, oh yeah, there's big problems, there's structural inequalities, but we're doing our best to make things better. And then when we asked them, so how did you get your job? They would tell a story along the lines of, well, you know, I was very lucky, I was in the right place at the right time, I think I gave a good impression at the interview, without kind of saying, also, the entire system has been designed to benefit people who look and sound like me. And so they would stress as well how limited they were in what they could do. That they really believed in the principles, but they were limited in their ability to address the process. And so I'm going to show you a couple of quotes about this. And I want to show you this first set of quotes, because when I say misrecognition, when I mean people claiming that there weren't any problems, it was rare, that's not to say that it never came up. My favourite bit is we worked with a designer, a very successful, very prominent designer. Obviously, can't tell you who any of these people are. Towards the end of the interview, said, gender lines, I think it's actually now more female than male. It's at least 50-50. It fucking isn't. But most of the quotes were a little bit more like this. So this is somebody who works in publishing in an editorial role. When we spoke to him, he was like 27, and he was already making decisions not just about who to hire. He'd been in interview panels, but also, you know, what books to say yes to and what books to say no to. Like, there's a lot of young people, like young men with these decision-making roles. And so, in this quotation, he reflects on how frustrating he finds it that, you know, he's part of the problem. He is part of the historically sort of celebrated, historically privileged groups in a number of different ways, and he finds it frustrating from a social justice perspective, but he also finds it frustrating from a professional perspective, that if everyone looks and sounds like you, then the range of voices in the room, the range of perspectives in the room is going to be limited, and this has got implications for the kinds of work you're going to do. I'm not going to read these quotes out, partly because they're quite long, but partly because I'm going to be doing this the whole time, which is a little bit rude. So, but obviously, you know, so this was one of the big things that came out. People acknowledging that there were inequalities, and that these inequalities were politically important from a social perspective of social justice, but they were also professionally important, that these inequalities have implications for the kind of work that gets made. And this was, you know, no one cares if accountancy is mainly white people. It isn't. Accountancy is pretty open. But one of the struggles was this idea that people working in cultural, and this is just one quote, but it captures a range of different things. This is a guy, this guy was actually from working class origins and reflected at length about how his own background had, you know, had made the process of getting in more difficult, how his experience was quite different from, for example, some of the people that he went to university with who found the process a bit smoother. And no, you know, no one cares if accountancy is socially closed, is socially unequal. But this is a group of people that really believe in the transformative power of culture. They think of themselves as the good guys. They have these political and social commitments. They have, but also they think the work is transformative, that theatre can do things, that if theatre is given its suitable position socially, if more people go, if the right kinds of if a wider range of people get to make the work, then more people will come along. They'll have personally transformative experiences. The work is important. That's why people found it so frustrating. but that's also why people continue to commit. And this contrasts with when we ask people about their own experiences. Because when we ask people, so, you know, how did you end up in this kind of role? Can you tell us a little bit about how you've ended up doing this work? The word luck came up over and over again. And people were lucky in a number of ways. They were lucky to do the job they love. For a lot, like, they loved the work. It's frustrating, you know, like they spend a lot of time filling out forms, they're poor, it's stressful, but fundamentally they love it. Nobody gets into visual arts because they think it's going to be a stable career. I mean, honestly, I found the accountancy comparison so useful in terms of, you know, nobody gets into accountancy because they love spreadsheets, but doing the job enables them to be fulfilled in other dimensions of their lives. You know what? Fair enough. They were lucky in terms of when they came in. We hear very frequently, you know, in contrast to the stuff that I showed you earlier, well, you know, I was in the right place at the right time. In the 1980s, you could claim benefits for a certain amount of time. In the 1980s, you could rent a flat in Notting Hill that wasn't too expensive. You couldn't do that now. And they were luck in terms of why they were successful, them specifically. That's luck as well. Partly they were in the right place at the right time, but, you know, maybe a piece of work that they put together, you know, if they're a director, it just so happened that a producer was in town and they were a bit bored and they loved it and they invited them to do a bit more work for them. The idea of imposters, I don't know, is imposter syndrome something that comes across all the time, cross-nationally? Good, that's reassuring. The idea that they don't really know what they're doing and they're kind of just muddling through and they're hoping no one's going to find out. They've been lucky that no one's found them out yet. And there's this idea of what we call gentlemanly modesty, that nobody would ever say, you know what, I'm very good, I'm very successful, I've been successful because I'm good. People would say, oh, you know, I do all right, I've been bumbling through, I guess, you know, some people would say that I've been successful. And this is interesting because what we found is that people playing down their own success has implications of minimizing inequalities, visibility. If somebody talks about, you know, if somebody who's been really badly exploited and marginalized talks about their experiences, and one of our senior men says, well, you know, I haven't done that well either. I've had these bad experiences. I've been marginalised. And one of the effects of this is to make these inequalities less visible. And so here's an example. Michael, who talks about his experience of, I think this is the quote I'm thinking of. Yeah, so this is, he was in the right place at the right time, his argument. When he was going, the right status support was in the right, was kicking around. You were able to do various different things that you can't do now. But I want to talk to you about Andrew, who kind of had this portfolio career. He's pretty successful, reflecting on how he ended up where he is. Because I've got a couple of quite long quotes here, but I think this really helped us to understand the situation. And so he starts by talking about his experience of being recruited for his first job. And he said, you know what, and it was a pretty well-regarded role. A lot of people would love to do this job. And he said, you know what, I don't really know what I'm doing. I don't know anything about the art form. I don't know anything about the institution. And I'm going to try and pivot that into a strength. I'm going to argue that because I don't know anything, that's why you're the perfect person for me to hire. It's like when he tells us, like, it's genuinely very funny. He's a good storyteller, it's playful, it's interesting. But what doesn't come up here is this idea of the people who might have liked to have got that job, who didn't get it. This idea that he is able to pivot his lack of knowledge into a strength just through that incredible confidence that he's been inculcated with through for example, the educational institutions that he's gone through and his existing personal contacts. And the second thing is he says, you know, I completely bombed the interview. It was a disaster. I didn't know anything, but luckily I was the only person that they saw, and so they kind of had to hire me. That's true, but it misses the detail that if he was the only person invited, who else did they not invite? Given the job that it was, it's vanishingly unlikely that no one else applied for it. And then later on, he talks about he reflects on these problems. He reflects on the problems in the sector. He's very explicit about walking through, here are the social structural inequalities in the sector that I work in. Here are the negative consequences of them. But then he talks a little bit about this tension, that he says that, you know, everyone's hearts are in the right place. This is the challenge. You know, if you have a room full of people, most of whom are privileged white guys, and they really, really want things to change, that is different from, you know, like a room full of privileged white guys congratulating themselves on having stitched the whole thing up so that people like them and their friends get to do these jobs that they love. But then there's this real tension that came in towards the end. So when we're talking about, you know, you are a person in the position to be able to change things. You hire people. You make decisions about who comes into the system. And he says that, you know, we'd really love to change things, but in all these organisations, there's, as we know, like if it's accountancy, if you're hiring a lot of people, if some of the people that you recruit, you can take risks on them, because if they don't work out, it's fine, you can get a new person in 10 minutes. These arts organisations, the argument goes, are quite small and are quite delicate. And if you hire the wrong person, if you take a risk and it backfires, it's disastrous. The whole institution can fall over. And you can see, here we are. He says, when you've got one post to fill, you really don't want to fuck it up. And I think that kind of encapsulates the argument. But then the tension is here, you know, one of the things that we've learned about, like, if you look at how things are going where I am at the moment, if you look at current social structural disasters, these aren't problems that have been caused because too many people have taken a risk on people from marginalised groups. These are problems that, like, the riskiest group, it looks like, are actually people that look and sound like me. People that look and sound like me have been promoted beyond their ability, and this is where we have ended up. And so, having said at the start, you know, this is a senior guy, he's well-resourced, he's interesting, he's arguing he can't really do anything about it. And so we really see a tension there. If these people, this is one of the ways through which we think we can explain the persistences of social inequalities in arts and culture, because the people that we would assume can make a difference argue that they can't. But then, this is the most recent bit. This is very much not finished, but I thought it would be interesting to allude to in terms of opening up some dimensions to talk about for future work. The people that I've just talked about, hire junior people. If you are an editorial director, you hire publishing assistants. But who hires the artistic director of National Theatre? Those incredibly senior roles are put into place through governance and boards, which is what I've started to look at more recently. In a UK context, and I imagine this is true internationally, I've done a little bit of work on this. One of the advantages of working in the UK context is the standard of our data is pretty high, so I can actually get most of this and be reasonably confident that it's right. In other countries, there's issues with data quality, but also it can be expensive. In Australia, for example, it costs $19 to find out any single piece of this information, and that doesn't sound like that much money. It's going to become clear why it's a problem in a minute. Companies are governed by their directors. Charities are governed by their trustees. In a UK context, most of the kinds of CCIs that we're talking about are both. There is both a charitable institution and a limited company. That's not uniformly the case, but I kind of just need to flag it. And so what we're interested in doing is having a look at who governs these institutions. What we did was we started with the Arts Council's national portfolio. So the Arts Council in England funds a bunch of organisations. There's about 800 of them, and we wanted to see who are on those boards. Those boards are those organisations are obviously not the entire of the cultural and creative industries, but we started there because we thought partly it's a list of some description, and partly because what we were interested in looking at is which other boards are those people on. So if you just start with charities on their own, some of them look like this. Birmingham Opera Company has 9, trustees. And none of those trustees is on the board of trustees of any other national portfolio organisation. Other bits look like this. Here are a few that are connected to each other. So, you know, the Royal Opera House shares trustees with the Bristol Old Vic and National Youth Choirs and so on. I don't want to get too inside baseball. I don't want to go into too much detail about any individual organisation, because actually most of the network looks like this. When you connect everyone to everyone else, you basically just get this dense black cloud, which is sort of, in terms of the symbolism, is a bit of an issue. And so we want to know who they are. We wanted to know who are the people, firstly, who are the people who are on the most boards of directors of these prominent arts organisations? Secondly, we wanted to know who are the people kind of in the most central positions. You know, if the music world, everyone kind of shares directors with everyone else, you know, it's a sort of nested community. Nobody is in a particular position of power. If there's like a cluster of music and a cluster of dance, and there's one person bridging the two, that person is probably in a very powerful position in terms of governance and power within the arts. I'm not naming names yet because it's not finished. And so, in terms of people who are on a bunch of different boards, it's mainly arts specialists. You know, if you are an opera specialist, you know a lot about it. Opera companies probably want you to be on their board, and there's a few of them. Most of them are specialists. The one exception is a guy who bridges culture and sport. They're all men. But when we look at these bridges, when we extend the analysis to include the other organisations that people are on, you know, we're not just looking at the arts, you know, because somebody who's on the board of the Royal Opera House might also be on the board of the English National Opera, but they might also be on the board of KPMG, or a property development agency, or Goldman Sachs. These are all real examples.
Zagreb. Zagreb, National Gallery.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Follow the money. And so what we have a look at is, when we look at these bridges, some of them are sort of audience development specialists. You know, like they work within bits of the arts. And so if you're an audience development person, then a lot of the skills that you have and a lot of the techniques that you might suggest will apply similarly in visual arts or in music or in architecture or whatever. But most of them are management consultancy or property development. And what we find is that some of the sites in which bridging seems to take place, in which the settings in which people from different arts boards are talking to each other, is in property development. And they're all men. Follow the money. So, as I say, when you expand the network more generally, you have, it's what we're kind of referring to as organisational elites. They're all men. The key bit of governance that seems to be going on within the cultural sector is not a cultural elite, it's an organisational elite. And so when I said at the start that we can't solve the problems in culture without solving the problems in society, this is just reinforcing that position. And so, I've already talked for ages, and I think you kind of know what I think by this point, but culture and creative work, we know this, is marked by serious social inequalities. These social inequalities are fundamentally structural. These are not inequalities that will be addressed through spending 10 million euros on another diversity programme, because people from privileged groups will always find a way around it. We have found that these figures are surprisingly robust to policy interventions. If you want to do something, you have to do something radical. That's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Let me just briefly now make just a short intervention here before we go to Q&A, because I do believe that there are questions. You raised a lot of issues, and then there are certainly questions that you may answer and tell us more about. I'd like to hear Jaka, because Jaka is going to tell us more what is missing again in this structural inequality topic. And we will wrap it up with the Q&As from the audience and to go smoothly into what we've done here in Rijeka. My research team, Marin Lukanovic, Marko Luka Zupčić, Kristina Stojanović-Hajić, Kristina Smoljanović. We did also multi-methodological approach with the qualitative, quantitative research and also desk analysis, what is happening in CCI here in Rijeka and the county. I'd like to invite you to follow us, and Kristina will tell you more about the graphs that we presented in the hall on the way to the food just after the end of this session. So now please let us hear Jaka, and we'll go with the Q&A, and then we will go just before lunch. We will go to see our graphs that Kristina will present you. It will not take long, 10 to 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Please, Jaka. So what is missing?
Well, I hope I will kind of give an outline of some of these issues. And I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me. And I cannot promise that I will make this presentation very dynamic, especially not energetic. I kind of envisaged it in 3 parts. Kind of the first part, which will be connected to what Mark has been talking about, and I might reiterate some of the issues that have been actually going on general in research on cultural and creative industries. Like the second part will be where the energy kind of goes low, because I will try to contextualize it in the creation data and context. So that's where we kind of get depressed. But then in the third part, I will try to kind of speak more on the kind of work the CCI in Croatia and kind of what would be my view and orientation where the policy measures could be. And that's maybe where the kind of energy will go up. I kind of really thank you for raising so many issues that have been, I think, very, very beneficial. Because in the last decade, there is quite a proliferation of research on the structural individual conditions on working cultural and creative industries, with a specific emphasis on precarious trait of work-life facilitation of cultural and creative workers, the work done by Hesmond Halch, Banks, Blair, Randall, etc. These research endeavors, primarily centered in Europe, are strongly influenced by UK scholarship. Unravel the precarious complexity of the fragile social position of cultural and creative workers, intersecting it with class, gender, racial, and ethnic inequalities in and of the creative industries as well. The research also shows that these sectors are far from being rewarding for the workers, and that many policy actions need to be done in order to achieve creative justice that would enable more openness and inequality in these sectors for people from different social backgrounds. As Mark Banks noted, it's his work on creative justice that is kind of based on the Nancy Fraser's research that Milan Živković has mentioned in his introductory lecture. It has been shown that there are diverse obstacles in entering and staying in the sector, which prompted questions on the diversity of content that these industries produce and disseminate. What also needs to be taken into account is the current socio-political climate where culture is viewed mainly from the economic lens. And there are more and more instances that marginalize the value of cultural work and contribute to precarization of position of creative workers. Data shows that there's a continuing trend of low pay and diminishing wages, and how access to arts and cultural education and jobs in the cultural creative industries are strongly determined by social background. So this opens the question, whose voices are not heard and whose culture is not represented. In order to answer these questions, one needs to highlight some of the traits of entering and working in the sector that reflect and reiterate the existing social inequalities and that further contribute to the unequal representation in the cultural and creative industries sector. Previous research has shown how the nature of creative work demands long-term temporal and financial investment in various skills and expertise that has been shown in Angela Macrobi's work, and Mark, you already mentioned some of these issues. Maintaining a successful career demands that at the beginning of career, different forms of non-paid work and underemployment as voluntary work, temp work, and so on are expected. Furthermore, the non-standard employment types, such as short-term contracts, office contracts, etc., are dominant in the sector, and thus the nature work reflects the reproduction of the already present class, gender, racial, and ethnic inequalities in contemporary capitalist societies in general that hinder the sustainability and durability of creative careers. Not everyone can work for free for a long period of time, and data shows that there are overrepresentation of workers from privileged off social backgrounds, as already mentioned in the previous presentation. Other research has charted the furthering of gender inequalities and has shown how women in the sector are in an inferior position to their male counterparts. This comes about as a result of the fact that there are gender inequalities in work and employment in general. For example, inequalities hiding behind the poetic terms such as glass ceilings and boys' clubs that are ingrained in the creative labor sector, and the request for constant availability for work, the network sociality of the sector itself, no borders between private time and free time are difficult more for female creative workers that already have the burden of child rearing and household chores, and thus creates much their sustainability of their careers in creative labor more difficult to sustain. Thus, the careers in creative labor are oriented more towards young male white workers of more privileged class backgrounds, as shown among others in not only in various research done in UK, in film and television context, cultural and creative industries in general, but also research done in creative industries in Vienna. The gender inequalities are also highlighted by research done by European Women's Audiovisual Network. Croatia was part of this project as well, and some of the data from this research was highlighted at this year's conference on women in audiovisual industry in Croatia, and it was very interesting to see that this issue has been debated here in Croatia as well at this large conference. It can be further contended that it was only when the status of these and positions held by these young white male middle class workers started to be endangered, that is when they became insecure, precarious, vulnerable, that the talk of the precariousness, fragility in creative labor in general started to be vocalized more strongly. However, there are those who see precariousness as a crucial trait of and specialness of creative labor, and who argue that unlike some other fields, cultural work and creative labor have been fragile, insecure, and precarious throughout history, as Rosgill and Andy Parrott noted. Authors have suggested that some creative workers have developed strategies for dealing with this precariousness of work in these sectors, resulting in precarious stability, as Helen Blair noted, or structured uncertainty, as Randall and Culkin noted. Others have located this insecurity in the project-based work dominant in the cultural and creative industries. However, they stress that this is not specific to creative labor only, and similar working practices can be found in other fields where work is comprised of a series of projects. However, as Andrew Rose noted, the fragility and insecurity or precariousness of creative labor are not unique developments, but stem from the overall conditions of labor in the context of its general transformation in the 21st century, and Hoofs also goes further on to argue that the employment stability has never been the norm, but merely a recent feature during the Fordist period, while flexibility and stability of employment have been customarily more customary historically. It is this project-based approach to work that is dominant in the cultural industry, but also in the independent cultural scene and in the freelance artistic work that contributes to the individualization of work positions of the employed in the sector. Cultural workers become portfolio workers, where the postulate where you're only good as your last job pertains. This patchwork career that this project-to-project work produces alongside the weakening of traditionalized unionized labor contributed to the rise of the precarious labor in the cultural and creative industries. Project-to-project orientation also lead to parallel jobs and work on additional tasks, where in the case of the former, workers are put in a situation where they cannot refuse to work, while in the case of the latter, the workers have to take jobs that are not connected to creative work, but are necessary in order to cover periods without work on cultural and creative projects. The research shows how for work in cultural and creative sector, that is important, what is important is the network sociality, as Andras Vittel stresses, which blurs the line between work time and free time. Many jobs are struck after office hours in informal surroundings of opening, exhibitions, festivals, etc., which also has consequences for furthering gender and class inequalities in the sector. In this sense, cultural and creative industries are sometimes described as a closed shop, or the big black cloud that Mark has shown, and various actions are necessary to bring about the much needed diversity in the sector, as is already kind of outlined in numerous research reports, and there are various policy actions either on the European level or in various countries that Sanja and her team also outlined in one of the research reports on which is available online, and you can take kind of a look at some of these actions. However, it can also be said that not enough voices in this cultural and creative industries research are heard from European periphery and semi-periphery on these issues. And preliminary research from selected countries from Southeast Europe show both similar but also culturally specific trends of the precarious nature of creative laboring in this region and of socioeconomic inequalities ingrained in the sector, as Peja Cvetićanin noted in his research on Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia, Michele Adou and Kostala on Greece, and Anna Lacovska in the case of Northern Macedonia. Additional authors also highlight the importance of understanding the regional differences within the country, as the Greek example of Avdikos and Kalogegesis. Thus, all the data and future policies in this sector need to be examined in a particular socio-political and economic context. In Croatian case, there is a general lack of research in the cultural field on the national level. And when I look at your quality of data where you present, I cry with envy.
We envy.
Specifically, it has to be highlighted in Croatia. The research on diversity in the cultural and creative sectors have not been done, and this is why your research is very, very beneficial. So kind of for the sake of our international audience, when going into kind of focus on Croatia, we need to stress it's a small country, 4.2 million inhabitants going down. And it has been the last country to enter the European Union in 2013. After the war in the 90s and the socioeconomic and political transition period that was somewhat turbulent, culminating in the last global economic crisis of 2008, whose echoes are still strongly present in Croatia while we're preparing for the next recession. All this has put its toll on the country's structural limitations, which resulted in the decade-long socioeconomic crisis that is still marked by a high unemployment rate, and immigration, especially among young people. Understanding the cultural and creative sectors have been also influenced by all these events. Before the economic crisis, when we did the research in 2007, we could have concluded, as we did, that Croatia had somewhat emergent local market of cultural and creative products, while in the last decade a decline occurred, which was exacerbated by the continuous drop of financing of culture on the national level. And the independent cultural scene has been very much struck by these issues, with continuous underfunding on the national and local level, with additional cuts in specific subsectors such as non-profit media that perpetuated its crisis. The pressure has been put from the policy level on the need of different cultural operators for attracting the European funds in order to fill in the missing gaps of national and local funding. But these favorize bigger operators and put additional bureaucratic obstacles for all the cultural operators, especially the small ones. So if we want to talk about the evidence-based policy making, and I think we want to, because especially when looking at the Saturday last event, one actually needs to take the data that is available. And in Croatia, we stumble upon several obstacles. The national representative data on culture provided by the Croatian Bureau of Statistics is very limited and gives only basic data on the cultural infrastructure, cultural participation, only entrance to the museums, cinema tickets, etc. Basic data, public investment in the cultural sector, employment in the cultural sector, very basic means, and data on household investments in recreation and culture. And it also has to be stressed that there is no national-wide research on the cultural participation, consumption and tastes, nor on cultural production that is connected to the social stratification of Croatian society, which would help us in determining actually what are the different levels of inequalities in culture as such. What is more, the social stratification research, especially if we want to say class-related research, has been neglected in the last couple of decades, especially class being a very sensitive politically as a term, with the recent resurgence of interest in what class means actually in post-socialist contexts such as ours. So there are two kind of projects that I would like to highlight, which would in the future be beneficial for our research as well, but that still don't have published data yet because they're ongoing. One recent project is on social stratification in Croatia, structural and subjective aspects from the University of Zagreb, which has a dedicated strand on cultural capital, and looking forward in hearing those results. And the other projects from the Institute of Social Research, which only presented some preliminary data in the last sociological congress, talks about the class structure of post-transitional Croatian society, but looking at taking household as a unit of analysis, which I think is very important when talking about social inequalities in Croatia, as a better starting point for the analysis rather than some other Western countries type of research that are very dominant. I'm just mentioning this in order to illustrate kind of the necessity of understanding the multi-layered and the complexity of Croatian society, and on the need of taking and developing our own research models in order to understand actually what we are talking about when we're talking about social inequalities in Croatia. So thus, we kind of still have to wait for more detailed analysis in order to better understand the social stratification of Croatian society and on cultural participation, cultural consumption, and taste as well. I would like to highlight here, because I think because I will give a few outlines of the fragmentary of the research that has been done that is connected to these issues, and that would give us kind of an overview of maybe what needs to be taken into account and who would be missing in the Croatian context. For example, the research done by Tonković, Marcelić, and Krolo on connection between cultural consumption, social inequality, and regional differences in Croatia, which was based on Eurobarometer data, indicate a strong correlation between both indexes of cultural consumption and several indicators of socioeconomic status, education level, gender, and residential status. And they show that there are significant differences in various Croatian regions, with wider metropolitan era Rijeka and Gorski Kotar, that are only regions with above than average cultural consumption index. And I think that is important to hear here in context of this project. It follows that cultural consumption is strongly related to the overall development of an area. It has to be said that the data on the cultural sector in Croatia is rather fragmented, as I already noted, and there is no systematic longitudinal data on a cultural sector, nor on cultural and creative industries in particular. In the last 2 decades, the data on cultural and creative industries in Croatia have been collected 2 times within 2 different projects. The first was a project that I participated in, done at our institute from 2002-2006 on creative and knowledge industries in transition countries. And this other project was done in 2015 through the report by Institute of Economics done for the Croatian cluster of cultural and creative industries competitiveness. The latter study indicated that the cultural and creative industries in Croatia have a 2.3 share of the Croatian GDP, that they have 3% of the total number of employees in Croatia, and have a 5.7 share in the total number of business entities and 2.4 share in total revenues in Croatia. The authors point out that the culture and creative industries have a high proportion of employees with higher education, but also that there are micro-entrepreneurs, self-employed persons whose work engagements are more often through atypical forms of employment. The authors point out that the cultural and creative industries in Croatia were competitive, more resistant to recession than the rest of the economy, but also weakened by the long-term recession. And both of these research projects stress the centralization of activities to the capital city of Zagreb. Furthermore, when we look at the policy level at the available research data, we can say that within national and local public policies, there is no consistent strategic orientation towards this sector. Local and regional policies are oriented towards financing in sectoral way, while at the national level, instruments targeted specifically at this area are limited. On the national level, we can talk about only on the instrument for cultural entrepreneurship. There are advocacy pressures from certain sectors towards the introduction of new policy instruments for specific areas, and initiatives where the legislative alignment is needed to facilitate business and to better identify the cultural and creative industries in general. Specifically, the already mentioned cluster was one of these advocates. It is precisely the diversity of subsectors and the necessity to approach each of them differently or through diverse transversal instruments within the complex ecology of public policy, in Bell and Oakley's term, which in turn imply the involvement of different stakeholders in the creation of these instruments, make the creation of public policies to encourage the culture and creative industries as a very complex task. In the context of a small country, such as Croatia, that is in a longer session, where total public funding for culture is low, just like the contribution of citizens for the same purpose, where sponsorships for arts and culture are almost non-existent, and where the market is small, it has to be noted that culture and creative industries cannot exist without continuous public support. The necessity of public incentives for the sustainability of this sector is also proving important in other European countries characterized by so-called small languages and focus on domestic audiences and domestic market as well. All the data presented earlier indicate that the cultural and creative industries have proven more resilient to recession than the rest of the economy. They remain vulnerable to the overall economy as such. Barriers also lie in the lack of recognition of the value of work in the sector, its broader contribution to society as well as the economy, and thus the lack of policy making with wider stakeholders from other economic sectors. Data shows that these predominantly micro-enterprises employ mostly project-oriented, highly educated, flexible workforce, which due to the high intrinsic motivation to the work in the sector, advocating for the value of the content they produce, represent both the great potential of the sector and provide explanation for the sector's resilience in a continuing crisis. Very big subjective involvement in the work that they do. But barriers also exist in the lack of education for the specific fast-changing needs of the subsectors, the underdevelopment of information and communication infrastructure, and a lack of digital and media literacy, the uneven also cultural infrastructure throughout the country, and the high impact of global media companies and platforms. Similarly, for the entire cultural sector in Croatia, obstacles are the lack of systemic monitoring of data in the sector and the more detailed research on the situation and needs in the sector and insufficient public allocation for the sector in general. The research done by colleagues from Zadar and Zagreb as well show that the career in this sector is not only a job but a calling. Therefore, the whole way of life, where there are no more borders between work time and free time, and which demands identification with work and a constant availability of work for work. Partial data on work in creative industries in Croatia and in Southeastern Europe, as well as on conditions of work in civil society organizations in contemporary culture and arts in Croatia, show the blurring of the borders between business time and private time and a constant inclusion in the work process. That also then results in self-exploitative practices of the workers. For cultural and creative industry sector, the input of voluntary work, intern work, and different types of work, of unpaid work, as such, has been very important, which has been shown on the European level as well. And as already noted, it has been shown as important for entering in the sector. This has been shown to be the case for both workers from the cultural industry sector and for workers from independent cultural scene in Croatia. However, in Croatia we do not have data on the input of the voluntary work in culture as such, or specifically in cultural and creative sectors. And the selected research shows how cultural workers, due to structural inadequacies, as well as high identification with work in the sector, often do unpaid overtime work and have these already mentioned self-exploitative practices. The estimations on voluntary work and other types of unpaid work in general would help us on the one hand to indicate to what extent work in this sector is underpaid, and on the other hand that the price of culture and arts in Croatia or anywhere else where this could be measured is actually much higher than shown. So the selected data shows that the potential in this field lies in a highly educated, highly engaged and dedicated workforce that identifies with work in the sector and is subjectively very involved in the work process itself and in the end result of its work. For the most part, workers in this sector are continuously involved in the work process, where the boundaries between private and business life are being erased. It is then this continued involvement in the work process taken together with the underfunding of the sector that cannot employ a sufficient number of workers that creates obstacles which result in the self-exploitation practices. Project-oriented, individualized, fragmented workers do not have the capacity to adequately protect their labor rights, which makes them vulnerable. Volunteering is proving to be an important entry point for the sector, which can be a limiting factor for many young people who do not have a good socioeconomic background and can thus lead to, or already leads to, because we do not know in the Croatian context, class inequalities in entering and staying in the sector. At the same time, it is precisely the project type of work and the network sociality that is also essential for survival in the sector and that can contribute to the deepening of the already mentioned gender and class inequalities. More insight and in-depth research on both work in the sector and related issues on access to culture, cultural infrastructure, cultural participation, cultural education are needed. And furthermore, the centralization issue and regional diversity issue need to be tackled in the wider cultural development perspective as well. It is precisely in the context of a small country such as Croatia, where we do not have enough research data, both general about the cultural sector and specifically about social and class inequalities in cultural production, distribution and participation, that we should approach carefully to creation of public policies for the work in culture and creative industries. Further development policies and trends should be viewed in the context of the entire cultural system, the so-called cultural ecology, which is based on the notion of culture as a public good and not on the possibility of negative consequences of public policy instruments that are based solely on the market principle that are then later on visible through gentrification and social polarization. Thus, policies for the development of the cultural and creative industries should be based on the detailed analysis and assessment of the sector, taking into account the accessibility issues, the type of content produced, and the social and economic impact of the sector, the participatory creation of the instruments within each subsector, and the development of models of intersectoral cooperation. So, me being here the academic bore, I would like to with this conclude my presentation, and I'm open for all your questions here, now, and later on the next few days.
Thank you, Jaka, very much. Before going into Q&As, I'd just like to have a overglance impression. Well, you probably all know Thomas Piketty, and you know Michel Houellebecq. The Piketty sold 5 times more books than Houellebecq, his previous book with the no sex scene in there. And what was it about? Well, it was about a capital. And what is the capital? Well, that's the money. And just a few days ago, he just published the new brick, because those books are 1,000 pages long. And in French, it will be published in English in March 2020. Well, if I resume his point of view, I didn't read the book. I just took an overview. His solution is global, because we do need to act global now and lose all these local, sectorial, whatsoever, structural. We are talking about structures, so we need to act global. His solution is like he said it's a heritage for all, and this heritage for all should be taxed. How? Well, we need to transform private property into a, he said, social and temporary property. So that's a clue for what we are going to read in Piketty very soon. And this is also a kind of introduction in what we are going to present you in our short, in the overview of our short results that Christina will do later on. Why it's important? What is it that we did? We did a research on obstacles, we did a research on talents, we did also, we went into details of what is wrong? What is wrong? Well, the answer should be global, and we should all stand for at least for this global answer altogether. Please, now we have British perspective. You didn't hear when I said secular trust.
Oh yeah, no, I got it.
That's it. That's something which is also again related to a money issue, because when the money is poisoned, especially on that global level, like Epstein, who funded tons of artistic things, etc., and then pedophile accusations that went against him was like nothing compared to the money that he invested into arts and science in the last 30 years. So how we are going to get rid of these poisonous things and start being and continue being creative, continue being ourselves and authentic in what we are doing? That's my first question to Mark and to Jaka, and then I'm opening the floor to your interventions as well. Thank you. Go ahead.
Cool, all right, I'll start. So I sort of alluded to this very, very quickly during the presentation, because I was largely talking about structure. But, you know, like, when we talk about inequalities, there's often a question of inequalities of what? And when we talk about, you know, historically marginalised groups, it's generally code for money. You know, like, what is the resource that people care about? And obviously, Sackler's a high-profile example, but the more interesting, one of the really interesting cases in the UK context is I'm friends with people that run a bunch of different sort of parallel things, including, oh God, so one of those prominent, the one I know best is what's called Reclaim Our Bard, which is in response to sponsorship of the Royal Shakespeare Company by BP and other like fossil fuel organisations. BP quite heavily sponsors a range of institutions, including the British Museum, the RSC, and various others. And one of the things that actually comes up quite strongly through that, and you know, like it's completely different infrastructure, because with the Epstein stuff, I don't know if anyone's been following the MIT case in the last week. It's all very hush-hush, like it involves not using his name because influence manifests itself in different ways. He wants, you know, he's interested in becoming influential, sort of like pushing his approach to eugenics. Whereas with BP and organisations like, you know, I was about to say, you see this a lot when you're going through airports. Obviously, by flying a lot was part of the problem, but the value in that is to make BP look like a good, you know, a good institution. You see these adverts talking about how they're converting to renewables. Like, they're not. Like, there's a little bit, but not really. And I don't know, as you, I guess you kind of got, I'm not very optimistic about anything. Like, this is bigger than the arts, you know, like, this capital and, you know, the one finding, like, the argument that goes through the sort of 1,000 pages of Capital in the 21st Century is R is greater than G, which is to say that it's, like, money makes more money than people. So the best way to get more money is to start with a lot of money. And to an extent, culture is a sideshow. Like, culture's fun, people like it, but when people who work in the sector think of culture as transformative and powerful in changing societies, that's not how the people who run it think about it. And I think if you want to get into these big conversations, you need, so thinking about, I alluded to social mobility a bit, the best, if you look cross-nationally, the best way to increase levels of social fluidity, the numbers of people going into different kinds of jobs, which are different from the kinds of jobs that their parents did. The best way to do that isn't to do what the UK focuses on, which is things like, like elite education, so that kids from poor backgrounds can end up doing whatever they want. The best way to increase social mobility is to ensure that downward mobility is fine. Because the problem isn't not enough rich kids who will have the ability to do these prominent jobs. The problem is, not enough poor kids who want to do these jobs. It's not enough rich kids who are willing to become bus drivers. So if becoming a bus driver is all right, if working class jobs are treated appropriately, have suitable levels of esteem, are paid well enough, then downward mobility isn't a problem. And so when you look at the societies with the highest levels of social mobility are also the societies with the lowest levels of income inequality. So, which means that the prizes associated with the best jobs compared with the worst jobs are, the range is narrower.
Thank you.
So, social transformation.
Yeah, what do you think about this social mixage?
But I think already there are examples. I think that in Norway, due to this no problem of the downward mobility, they now have a problem of actually people applying to universities, because it is okay to be a worker.
That's
and
right.
It's a respectable job, so it's not a problem. You can really live your life beautifully as a bus driver or machinist or something like that. But I think that, and I wanted to struck, the need for, I'm a researcher and we're always pining for, more money for research and that more data needs to be gathered. But really, we are really missing data in this context. And if we want to talk about the inequalities, we actually have to see the picture of,
how you're going to compare things.
What are we going
to get?
Yeah, what it is, what is working class in the Croatian context? What is,
if there is any?
If there is any, what we, in the public terms, usually there is the notion of the diminishing middle class in Croatia, but
we still don't know.
We don't know. But the kind of the indications for the bad situation has been done by colleagues who did the research in education of the less in the educational field that less and less young people from unprivileged backgrounds can afford to go to higher education, and that is a problem, and that has implications also for culture, because if you cannot go to higher education, not to artistic education, cultural education, and such. So, but I think that we have to see the picture in order to talk about what are actually the inequalities in Croatian societies, and then especially in this sector.
It just reminded me of a new Jarmusch bus driver poet. So you can be a bus driver and a poet, no problem. Questions, please. Yes, Marin Lukanovic.
Quick question for Mark. You talked about luck, and we researched luck for a bit in our research as well. But you had one example of a white 40-something guy who came in and basically lied his way through the interview. My question is, if it were a minority person or I don't know what, where would there be a bias in, this guy is a smooth operator versus this guy or this person is a grifter? Would there be an implicit bias? Was he lucky, or was he lucky because he was also white and guy?
So it's difficult to, I wasn't in the interview, so I'm kind of speculating, but based on what we know, based on, a whole bunch of sociological research through, like a long trajectory, there's two things going on. So, you know, you started by saying if it was like, say, somebody who was a member of an ethnic minority in that interview, would they have been seen as a grifter rather than, oh, he's, you know, he definitely knows what he's doing, he'll bring a new perspective? I think the answer to that is probably yes. It depends on obviously, it depends exactly who's on the panel, different people are going to have different perspectives, but there's been a load of work in the last couple of years in sociology on what's described as cultural matching. Yes. So it's like, you know, it doesn't matter if they don't know anything about the job, if they are the same kind of person as us, then they'll probably pick it up. You know, like they might not know anything about this particular visual art form that we do, but we went to the same college, like, you know, we have a bunch of the same interests, they'll probably fit in. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that when you say, you know, if it had been, say, a member of an ethnic minority in the interview, I think that's actually quite a big assumption. And the fact that he made it to the interview in the first place, even though he didn't know anything, is something which is informed by the kind of person that you are. Because, you know, like, part of it is about the luck in getting through the interview, but it's also the luck in getting to the interview. Who gets to be lucky in that? Because, you know, if they shortlisted two people and the other one knew a ton about the art form and also was personal and they liked them, they probably would have got appointed. But who gets to be lucky in getting to the interview for something you don't know about in the first place, I think is also going on.
Thank you, Jaka and Mark, for this valuable insight in social structure of workers in the cultural sector. Obviously, thanks to the relatively high levels of social cultural capital, these occupations are still valuable, desirable occupations still, which is probably not the case anymore with the media employment. Do you have any insight in the structure of the workforce in the media sector, or do you have any hypothesis about same problems in that field? Thank you.
Do you want to go first? You can go first. Okay. So what I would say about the media, like, this is going to sound glib and I don't mean it to be. The media field doesn't exist. So jobs in TV are completely different from jobs in film, are completely different from jobs in journalism, are completely different from jobs in video games. It sounds obvious, but so for example, like thinking about journalism, I think is a good example because like with the worsening conditions in journalism, you know, there's no money in print journalism anymore. Like online has in no way mitigated the losses. I work at a university that has a journalism school. Like the applications to do journalism as a degree have never been higher. From like smart kids, interesting, sparky kids who really want to do it. I would have made the same assumption as you, as that as conditions worsen, fewer people want to do it, but that doesn't seem to have happened. But yeah, with respect to the media, it's a little bit different. With other bits of the media, it's a little bit different across different sectors. The big difference between film and TV and games is that film and TV tends to be project-based. So, if you work unless you work like for a studio, if you're a camera operator, or even if you're a director, you work on films and you get hired for a film and you need to get hired for another one afterwards or you're not going to have any money. And so precarity manifests itself in different ways, but from colleagues, I've got some colleagues who specialise in film and TV, and it's exactly the same. There's a bit more money, but not a lot more money. And the money's very unequally distributed. Most people who work in film and TV are really poor. They work on projects that don't really go anywhere. Everyone's hope, but it's a different form of exploitation. If you work on a film with your friends, you make a short, and you all put money in it because you want it to work, and it doesn't make any money. I struggle with this a bit. You're not really being exploited by a third party. There's no film studio that's taking all the money. You're just spending your money on making a film that no one goes to see. Video games, by contrast, most people, I'm doing some work with video games at the moment, people having permanent contracts is much more common. But it's heavily socially stratified. In some ways you'd expect, in some that you wouldn't. It's not well paid. It's astonishingly poorly paid given the level of skill and expertise that they're asking for. So it's more similar than it is different, is what I would say in response.
I would kind of concur with what you noted about really different subsectors when we're talking about the media work. I think Mark Doise has done quite a good overview of media work through the different subsectors. But I would like to kind of go back to the kind of previous intervention on the type of kind of hiring in the cultural sector, the question of luck. And you noted something about the small delicate arts organizations and how for them hiring is very, very important, very, very specific. And you have to get kind of the real person for the job. And we also got similar data when we did research on the independent cultural sector in Croatia, where basically jobs were personalized in a way. So if a person leaves, kind of the whole portfolio of the work of this person goes with them. Mm-hmm. So if you're hiring somebody new, you cannot actually get somebody who will do the same thing. So every kind of hiring, every job in a way in these type of organizations are quite personalized, and that's how this hiring process is created in this way. So I just wanted to kind of highlight and connect our data with what you mentioned.
Yeah, and I mean similarly with project work, it's not like if you want to be the director, like if you want to get hired as a camera operator on a movie, that you send in your CV and then you have a job interview. Like the process of appointing people to these jobs is almost like, yeah, I mean, I'm not a specialist in these worlds, but from having spoken to colleagues, it's really heavily based on personal contacts. And so when it's based on personal contacts, who you've worked with before and who you like, of course it's going to end up socially closed.
And especially the work in TV and film industry, Helen Blair has done about that, talks about the semi-permanent work groups that are because a director likes to work with a specific director of photography.
He creates a crew, his crew.
So these are kind of the talk about semi-permanent, and then of course it's going to be closed in a way. It's very personalized.
In theatre as well, you have semi-permanent groups in theatre. Director, costume designers,
I do believe it's all in all performing arts. Whatever you do, have a group that you need to coordinate, articulate, and work together. Because you have our title of our report is "Time and Risk Create Quality." It's because you need time to do something good. It's not that you're going to recruit 2 persons. Okay, now we need to do it, and in a week we will. No, it's not possible. So this is what it's. And maybe it's also. Yes, go ahead.
Who is really missing, what communities are really missing in these researches. Like, I think Roman people, gypsies, are especially excluded in Croatia. They are completely invisible. Who are those, what communities are those in the UK, or which communities are going to become after the Brexit?
But this is a huge conference. That's not a one answer. It's like a next conference.
I think, in Croatia we could say that minorities are missing in a sense that it is kind of legally very well kind of normatively put but they are kind of, it's my opinion, put in their own niches, like minority cultures. So it's not kind of ingrained in the general culture, and it's not inclusive. So it is, on paper, kind of, everything works.
Politically correct.
And they have their niches. You cannot say it's not funded enough. You cannot say that there are not enough programs. But I think on the it's not. We're too much kind of homogen. So I think, but and in further on in specific sectors, I think there are general inequalities, as already mentioned. I think in audiovisual industry they kind of stressed it very well. We're going to hear something about the music industry later on, and I think there was quite interesting debate. Was it already a year ago? About women in Croatian music critique.
So I've sort of, most of it in a UK context, I sort of alluded to a lot of it. The two groups I didn't talk about who, from our work, and I'll just make this really quick, two groups we spoke to that have particularly been sharply affected by discrimination are people with disabilities and others.
Yeah. Well, we did it also with ex-convicts.
Oh.
Yes. So you will see that later on. Please.
People with disabilities in Croatia,
it's
even just on the technical level, they cannot enter the buildings. That's already a problem, and then not.
You have visible and invisible difficulties, but they're both excluded. Yes.
Further on, other types of content.
There was a question at the back.
They're hungry.
Well, let us then go to our hall. Christina will just present you briefly our research, and then I wish you to enjoy the meal. Thank you.